The year was 2347, and humanity had changed forever. Earth was no longer alone in the universe. Men and women had spread across the stars and built homes on 17 different worlds. They had learned to travel faster than light, and they had discovered something even more important. They had discovered that the universe was full of life. Commander Nathan Cole stood on the observation deck of the diplomatic vessel Endeavor and watched the stars drift past. He was a tall man with gray eyes and a calm voice that made people trust him. He had served in the Earth fleet for 20 years, and he had seen many things, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to witness. Endeavor was approaching a world called Valoran Prime. It was a beautiful planet with purple oceans and silver, forests that stretched across entire continents. The Valorans had invited humanity to visit their world, and Commander Cole had been chosen to lead the diplomatic mission. Ambassador Kira Voss stood beside him. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a warm smile. She had spent her entire life studying alien cultures and preparing for this moment. First contact with a friendly species. It was the dream of every diplomat. The shuttle descended through clouds that sparkled with golden light. When they landed, the Valorans were waiting for them. They were tall creatures with feathered bodies and gentle faces. Their eyes were large and filled with an intelligence that seemed ancient and kind. They moved with grace and spoke in voices that sounded like music. High Speaker Taloris stepped forward to greet them. He was the leader of the Valoran people, and he carried himself with quiet dignity. His feathers were white with age, but his eyes were bright and curious. Ambassador Voss bowed in the traditional Valoran greeting that she had studied for months. High Speaker Taloris smiled and returned the gesture. In that moment, two civilizations began a friendship that would change the galaxy. The Valorans were unlike any species humanity had encountered. They had no military and no weapons. They had devoted their entire civilization to healing and wisdom. Their medical technology was centuries ahead of anything Earth possessed. They could cure diseases that had killed millions of humans. They could repair injuries that human doctors considered impossible. But the Valorans asked for nothing in return. They shared their knowledge freely because they believed that healing should never be bought or sold. They taught human doctors their techniques and gave them access to medicines that seemed like magic. Dr. Samuel Grant was one of the first human doctors to study on Valoran Prime. He was a young man with brown hair and eager hands. He spent 3 years learning from Valoran healers, and what he discovered amazed him. They could regrow lost limbs. They could cure cancers with a single treatment. They could extend human lifespans by decades. When Dr. Grant returned to Earth, he brought this knowledge with him. Hospitals across human space began using Valoran techniques. Millions of lives were saved. Humanity owed the Valorans a debt they could never repay. But not everyone in the galaxy was happy about this friendship. The Galaxy Council had ruled the known universe for 10,000 years. They were a collection of 12 ancient species who believed they had the right to control all others. They made laws that favored themselves and punished anyone who challenged their authority. High Counselor Drevin is the most powerful member of the council. He belonged to a species called the Centauri, who were known for their cruelty and ambition. They conquered dozens of worlds and enslaved entire civilizations. Driven viewed humanity as insects and the Valorans as tools to be used. For centuries, the Council had exploited the Valorans. They demanded their medical technology and threatened them when they refused. The Valorans had no way to defend themselves, so they had always given in. But now things were different. Now the Valorans had friends. Admiral Laura Bennett commanded the 3rd Fleet of the Earth Navy. She was a woman with iron-gray hair and a reputation for never backing down. When she learned about the Council's treatment of the Valorans, she made a decision. She moved her fleet to Valoran Prime and announced that Earth would protect its allies. The Council was furious. No young species had ever defied them so openly. High Counselor Drevin demanded that humanity withdraw its ships. Admiral Bennett refused. Ambassador Voss worked tirelessly to ease tensions. She traveled to the Council homeworld and spoke before the assembled leaders. She explained that humanity wanted peace, but would not abandon its friends. The council members listened with cold eyes and said nothing. Commander Cole spent those months getting to know the Valoran people. He visited their cities and walked through their silver forests. He ate their food and learned their songs. He discovered that they were kind and gentle and wise. They reminded him of the best parts of humanity. High Speaker Telluris became his friend. They would sit together in the evenings and watch the twin moons rise over the purple ocean. Telluris would speak about the history of his people and the dreams they had for the future. He believed that one day all species would live in peace. He believed that kindness was stronger than cruelty. Commander Cole wanted to believe that too, but he had seen too much of the galaxy to be so hopeful. He knew that the Council would not accept this alliance. He knew that trouble was coming. Lieutenant Hannah Price served aboard a small reconnaissance ship called the Sentinel. She was young and brave and very good at her job. Her ship patrolled the borders of Valoran space and watched for any signs of danger. She reported directly to Admiral Bennett, and she took her duty seriously. One night, she detected a Council fleet gathering near the edge of the system. Hundreds of warships were assembling in formation. She reported this to Admiral Bennett immediately. The Admiral studied the information with worried eyes. The Council claimed the fleet was conducting routine exercises, but Admiral Bennett did not believe them. She ordered her ships to increase their patrols and prepare for trouble. Ambassador Boss sent urgent messages to the Council demanding an explanation. They did not respond. The silence was more frightening than any threat. Commander, Cole stood with High Speaker Telluris on the balcony of the Great Temple. The Valoran leader looked tired and sad. He told Commander Cole that his people had lived in fear of the Council for thousands of years. They had always hoped that one day they would find friends who would stand beside them. Now that day had come. Whatever happened next, the Valorans were grateful. Commander Cole promised that humanity would never abandon them. He meant every word. He had no idea that in 3 short months, that promise would be tested in ways he could never imagine. The Galaxy Council was preparing something terrible. And when it came, the universe would never be the same. The attack came without warning on a peaceful morning. When the twin suns of Valora Prime were just rising, over the silver forests, Dr. Samuel Grant was working in the medical research facility on the eastern continent. He was teaching a group of young Valoran healers about human biology when the first explosion shook the building. He ran to the window and looked up at the sky. What he saw made his blood turn cold. Hundreds of warships were descending through the clouds. They were Centauri vessels, and they were firing on the cities below. The Galaxy Council had declared that Valorans guilty of sharing restricted medical technologies with humanity. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. The Valorans had been sharing their healing knowledge with other species for thousands of years. But the Council did not care about truth. They only wanted an excuse to punish those who had defied them. High Counselor Drevin had planned this attack for months. He had gathered the largest fleet in Council history, and he had waited for the perfect moment. That moment came when Admiral Bennett's Third Fleet was called away to deal with a crisis on the other side of human space. A crisis that Drevin himself had arranged. Lieutenant Hannah Price was aboard the Sentinel at the edge of the Valoran system when the Council fleet arrived. Her small ship was hidden behind a moon, and she watched in horror as the invasion began. She tried to send a warning, but the Council had jammed all communications. Nothing was getting in or out of the system. She could only watch and record everything she saw. The Valorans had no weapons. They had no military. They had never needed them because they had always believed that the galaxy would protect the innocent. Now, they learned how wrong they had been. Council warships opened fire on hospitals and schools. They targeted temples where Valorans gathered to pray. They destroyed libraries that held thousands of years of wisdom. The bombardment was not random. It was systematic. The Council wanted to erase the Valoran civilization completely. High Speaker Telluris stood in the great temple and watched his world burn. He was old, and he had seen much suffering in his long life. But nothing had prepared him for this. His people were dying by the millions, and there was nothing he could do to save them. He broadcast a message to the entire galaxy. He begged for help. He pleaded with anyone who could hear him to send aid. But the Council had blocked all transmissions. His words never reached beyond the atmosphere of his dying world. Dr. Samuel Grant gathered the survivors from the medical facility and led them into the underground tunnels beneath the city. The tunnels had been built thousands of years ago for purposes no one remembered. Now they became shelters for the desperate and the dying. Captain Marcus Webb was leading a group of human volunteers who had been visiting Valoran Prime when the attack began. He was a soldier with a scarred face and steady hands. He had fought in many battles. But he had never seen anything like this. He organized the humans and the surviving Valorans into teams. They moved through the tunnels in darkness, guided only by small lights and the sound of explosions above. The ground shook constantly. Dust fell from the ceiling. Children cried, and adults whispered prayers to gods who seemed to have abandoned them. Captain Webb found hidden shuttles in an underground hangar that the Valorans had forgotten existed. The shuttles were old, but they still worked. He began loading refugees aboard and sending them into space through escape routes that the Council had not discovered. Lieutenant Price saw the shuttles emerging from the planet, and she guided them to safety. Her small ship could not fight the Council fleet, but it could lead the refugees through gaps in their formation. She saved thousands of lives that day by risking her own. The bombardment lasted for 3 days. When it finally ended, the Council landed troops to hunt down any survivors who remained. Centauri soldiers marched through the ruins of beautiful cities and killed anyone they found. They showed no mercy to the young or the old. They had been ordered to leave no witnesses, but they did not find. Everyone, Dr. Grant led his group deeper into the tunnels, till they reached caves that stretched for miles beneath the mountains. The Council soldiers searched, but they did not find the hidden passages. Hundreds of Valorans survived in those dark caves, kept alive by the courage of human doctors and soldiers who refused to abandon them. Captain Webb fought a desperate battle in the ruins of the capital city. His team of 20 humans held off Centauri soldiers for hours while the last shuttles escaped. When his ammunition ran out, he fought with his hands. When he could no longer stand, he crawled. He lost half his team that day, but he saved 3,000 Valoran lives. Admiral Laura Bennett received the distress signal for days after the attack began. She had realized that the crisis pulling her away was a trick, and she had turned her fleet around immediately. But space is vast, and even the fastest ships take time to cross it. When the Third Fleet arrived at Valoran Prime, they found a world in ashes. The purple oceans had turned gray with debris. The silver forests were burning. Cities that had stood for 10,000 years were nothing but craters and rubble. Admiral Bennett landed on the surface and walked through the destruction. She saw the bodies of children lying in the streets. She saw hospitals reduced to dust. She saw the great temple where High Speaker Taloris had stood. Now, just a pile of broken stones. Of the 8 billion Valorans who had lived on this world, fewer than 200,000 had survived. An entire civilization had been nearly wiped from existence in 3 days. High Speaker Taloris was among the survivors. Captain Webb had found him in the ruins and carried him to safety. The old Valoran was wounded, and his spirit was broken. He had lost his family and his world and his hope. Admiral Bennett knelt beside him and held his hand. She did not have words for what she felt. Rage and sorrow and shame that humanity had not been there to stop this. High Counselor A. Drevin sent a message to Earth that same day. He warned humanity to withdraw from Council space immediately. He said that what happened to the Valorans would happen to Earth if they did not obey. He believed that humanity would be afraid. He believed that they would run. He was wrong. Admiral Bennett stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched the message play. When it ended, she turned to her officers with fire in her eyes. She told them to send a reply. One word: no. The Galaxy Council had made an enemy. They did not yet understand what that meant, but they would learn. Humanity would teach them. The news of the Valoran massacre spread across human space like wildfire. Every screen on every world showed images of the destruction. People watched in horror as they learned what the Galaxy Council had done to their allies. They saw the burning cities and the mass graves and the faces of survivors. who had lost everything. Earth had never been so united. Old enemies forgot their differences. Political parties that had fought for centuries now stood together. When Parliament convened an emergency session, the vote for war was unanimous. Every single representative raised their hand. Humanity would fight, but Admiral Laura Bennett knew the truth that she could not share with the public. The Galaxy Council commanded fleets numbering in the hundreds of thousands. They had warships that were older than human civilization. They had weapons that could crack planets in half. Humanity had 300 ships. A direct attack would be suicide. She gathered her most trusted officers in a secret facility, deep beneath the mountains of Antarctica. Commander Nathan Cole was there. Captain Marcus Webb was there. Lieutenant Hannah Price was there. They sat around a table and looked at maps that showed just how hopeless their situation seemed. Admiral Bennett told them that they could not win a traditional war. The Council was too powerful and too numerous. If humanity tried to fight them directly, they would be destroyed within months. They needed a different approach. They needed to become something the Council had never faced before. Dr. Patricia Moore entered the room. She was a small woman with gray hair and glasses that sat crooked on her nose. She looked like someone's grandmother, but she was the most brilliant weapons scientist humanity had ever produced. She had been working on a secret project for 15 years. Now that project might save the human race. She explained her work in simple terms that even soldiers could understand. Her team had developed a way to make ships invisible. Not just hard to see, but completely undetectable to any sensor system known to exist. The technology bent light and absorbed radiation and masked every signature that a ship produced. A vessel using this system could pass within meters of an enemy and never be noticed. The officers listened with growing hope. This could change everything. But Dr. Moore warned them that the technology was not ready. It had never been tested in real conditions. The systems were unstable and dangerous. Under normal circumstances, they would need another decade of development before the technology could be used safely. Admiral Bennett asked how long she needed to make it work now. Dr. Moore thought for a long moment. Then she said 6 months. It would be rushed and risky, but she could do it in 6 months. The Admiral nodded. They had 6 months. Commander Nathan Cole was chosen to lead the new fleet. He would command 12 ships equipped with the experimental cloaking technology. They would be called the Shadow Fleet, and their existence would be the most closely guarded secret in human history. The ships were built in a hidden facility. In the asteroid belt, far from any trade routes or patrol paths, workers lived aboard the station for months at a time without any contact with the outside world. They knew that what they were building might save humanity, and they worked with dedication that bordered on madness. Chief Engineer Daniel Ross was responsible for making the cloaking systems function. He was a quiet man who spoke more to machines than to people. He had thick hands that could repair anything and a mind that understood technology the way poets understood words. He worked 20-hour days and slept in his workshop. When problems arose, he solved them. When systems failed, he fixed them. He never complained, and he never stopped. Lieutenant Hannah Price was assigned as tactical officer aboard the lead vessel. The ship was named Wraith, and it would be Commander Cole's flagship. Lieutenant Price spent her nights studying Council fleet movements and searching for weaknesses. She learned their patrol schedules and their communication protocols and the names of their commanders. She knew the enemy better than they knew themselves. The crews trained in absolute secrecy. They learned to move in silence and speak in whispers. They practiced operating their ships with minimal power so that no stray signal would give them away. They became ghosts before they ever left the station, while the Shadow Fleet prepared. Ambassador Kira Voss worked in the diplomatic shadows. She traveled in disguise to worlds that had suffered under Council rule. She met with leaders who hated the Council, but feared them too much to act. She offered them something they had never had before: hope. The Kreth, or a warrior species who had been enslaved by the Centauri for 300 years. They were forced to fight in Council wars and die for masters they despised. Ambassador Voss met with their hidden leaders and told them that change was coming. The Kreth listened, and they remembered. The Luminari were an ancient species whose homeworld had been stripped, mined by council corporations. Their planet was now a lifeless rock, and their people lived as refugees on stations and colonies throughout the galaxy. Ambassador Voss found their elders and spoke to them of justice. The Luminari had long memories, and they had never forgotten what was taken from them. The surviving Valorans burned with a quiet anger that surprised even themselves. They had always been peaceful, but peace had not protected them. High Speaker Taloris spoke to his people and told them that sometimes the gentle must find strength they did not know they possessed. The Valorans would not fight with weapons, but they would help in other ways. They would heal the wounded and shelter the hunted and share information that might help humanity win. 6 months passed. The Shadow Fleet was ready. Commander Cole stood on the bridge of the Wraith and looked at his crew. They were the best humanity had to offer. Pilots and engineers and soldiers who had volunteered for a mission that might kill them all. They had trained for this moment, and they were not afraid. Admiral Bennett sent a final message before they departed. She told them that the fate of humanity rested on their shoulders. She told them that the Valorans were counting on them. She told them to make the Council pay for what they had done. Commander Cole ordered the cloaking systems activated. The Wraith shimmered and then vanished from all sensors. One by one, the other 11 ships did the same. The Shadow Fleet moved out of the asteroid belt and into Council space. They made no sound. They left no trace. They were hunting, and their prey did not even know they existed. The Galaxy Council had awakened something they did not understand. Silent fury was coming for them, and they would never see it until it was too late. The first target was a supply depot near the edge of Council space. It was a massive station that provided fuel and weapons to Centauri military fleets. Thousands of workers lived aboard and hundreds of ships passed through every day. It was heavily guarded and considered impossible to attack. Commander Nathan Cole guided the Wraith through the darkness between stars. His crew worked in near silence. They spoke only when necessary, and even then in whispers. Every light was dimmed. Every system was dampened. There were shadows moving through the void. Lieutenant Hannah Price monitored the sensors and watched the Council patrols move in predictable patterns. She had studied these routes for months, and she knew exactly when the gaps would appear. She guided the Wraith through openings that lasted only minutes before closing again. The Shadow Fleet moved as one. 12 ships drifting through enemy territory like ghosts. They passed within meters of Council vessels, and no one noticed. They slipped past sensor arrays that should have detected them instantly. The cloaking technology worked better than anyone had hoped. Chief Engineer Daniel Ross sat at his station and watched the power readings with nervous eyes. The cloaking systems were still experimental, and any failure would mean instant detection and death. But the systems held steady. His work had paid off. The Wraith reached the supply depot and took position directly beneath it. The other ships spread out around the station in a perfect circle. They waited for the signal. Commander Cole gave the order. 12 ships fired simultaneously. Their weapons were specially designed to leave no signature that could be traced. The depot exploded in a ball of white fire that consumed everything within 10 kilometers. Secondary explosions ripped through fuel storage tanks and ammunition bunkers. The entire station was destroyed in less than 30 seconds. The Shadow Fleet was gone before the debris stopped spreading. Council investigators arrived hours later and found nothing. No weapons, signatures, no engine trails, no evidence of any attacking force. It was as if the station had simply ceased to exist on its own. The investigators filed confused reports and admitted they had no explanation. High Counselor Dreven received the news with growing unease. He ordered increased patrols around all major installations. He demanded answers that no one could provide. 2 weeks later, a weapons factory on a Centauri colony world exploded. Then, a communication relay station vanished. Then a fuel refinery. Then another depot. Then a shipyard where Council warships were being built. The attacks continued for months. Council installations disappeared across their territory with terrifying regularity. Each attack was silent and untraceable. The Council scrambled to respond, but they were fighting an enemy. They could not see or understand. Captain Marcus Webb led ground operations that supported the Shadow Fleet, his special forces teams, inserted onto Council worlds in small shuttles that could not be detected. They gathered intelligence and rescued prisoners and planted explosives that detonated days after they were gone. His teams moved only in darkness. They wore suits that absorbed light and masked their heat signatures. They communicated with hand signals and learned to move without making any sound. They became legends among the resistance movements that were growing across Council space. On one mission, Captain Webb led his team into a prison facility where Council forces were holding Kreth warriors who had tried to rebel. The prison was deep underground and guarded by hundreds of soldiers. Webb and his 12 operators infiltrated the facility through ventilation shafts and disabled the security systems from inside. They freed 300 Kreth prisoners and vanished before the guards even knew. Something was wrong. The freed Kreth returned to their people and told stories of human soldiers who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. The legend of the Shadow Fleet spread through whispers and rumors. Oppressed species began to hope that freedom might be possible. Lieutenant Price tracked Council fleet movements from the bridge of the Wraith. She noticed that their patrols were becoming erratic and disorganized. Commanders were afraid to stray too far from defended positions. Supply lines were breaking down because no one wanted to transport cargo through space where ships simply vanished. High Counselor Drevin grew paranoid. He surrounded himself with guards and moved his command center to a heavily fortified bunker. He ordered his fleets to patrol in tight formations with sensors constantly scanning. He offered enormous rewards for any information about the attackers. It did no good. The Shadow Fleet moved among the Council forces like wind through trees. They struck where they were least expected and disappeared before anyone could respond. They destroyed targets that should have been impossible to reach. Commander Cole led a mission into the heart of a Council fleet formation. His ship drifted between massive warships close enough to see individual crew members through their portholes. He planted sensor disruption devices on the hulls of 6 vessels and withdrew without being detected. When those ships entered battle 3 weeks later, their sensors failed at the critical moment. They were destroyed by their own confused allies. Admiral Laura Bennett coordinated everything from a hidden command post in deep space. She received reports from the Shadow Fleet and directed their operations like a conductor leading an orchestra of destruction. She worked with Ambassador Voss to time military strikes with diplomatic pressure. Ambassador Voss traveled constantly between resistance groups. The Kreth were preparing for open rebellion. The Luminari were providing intelligence about Council operations. Dozens of smaller species were quietly withdrawing their support from the Council. The Great Alliance that had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years was beginning to crack. Dr. Patricia Moore continued improving the cloaking technology. Each mission provided data that helped her make the systems more stable and effective. The Shadow Fleet grew stronger with every attack. 1 year after the massacre of Valoran Prime, the Council was in chaos. Their military infrastructure had been crippled. Their commanders were terrified. Their subjects were growing bold. Species that had been silent for centuries were beginning to speak of freedom. High Counselor Drevin called an emergency meeting of the full Council. He demanded that they commit all their remaining forces to finding and destroying the humans. But the other Council members were afraid. Some of them were secretly negotiating with Ambassador Voss. Others were simply looking for ways to survive what was coming, Commander. Cole received new orders from Admiral Bennett. The Shadow Fleet had proven what it could do. Now, it was time for the final mission. They were going to strike at the heart of the Council itself. They were going to end this war once and for all. The hunt was almost over. The prey just did not know it yet. 1 year after the massacre of Valoran Prime, the Shadow Fleet gathered at a hidden location in deep space. All 12 ships floated in perfect darkness with their cloaking systems active. Commander Nathan Cole stood on the bridge of the Wraith and studied the holographic display before him. The display showed Centaura, the homeworld of High Counselor Drevin and the seat of power for the entire Galaxy Council. It was the most heavily defended planet in the known universe. Thousands of warships orbited in layered defensive formations. Weapons platforms bristled from every moon. Sensor arrays scanned every inch of space for light years in all directions. Lieutenant Hannah Price had spent months mapping every detail of those defenses. She knew the patrol schedules and the sensor blind spots and the moments when guards grew tired and careless. She had found path through the impossible. Commander Cole addressed his crew. He told them that this was the mission they had trained for. He told them that millions of Valorans had died, and that the galaxy was watching, even if they did not know it. He told them that today they would deliver justice. The Shadow Fleet moved toward a Centaura. They traveled slowly to avoid creating any disturbance that might be detected. Days passed as they drifted through the outer defensive perimeter. They slipped between patrol routes that Lieutenant Price had memorized. They held their breath as massive warships passed close enough to touch. Chief Engineer Daniel Ross monitored the cloaking systems constantly. The strain of operating at full power for so long was pushing the technology to its limits. Warning lights flickered on his console, but he made adjustments and kept the system stable. Failure was not an option. The Wraith passed through the inner defensive ring and entered orbit around Centaura itself. Commander Cole looked down at the planet where the Council had ruled for 10,000 years. Great cities covered the surface. Towers reached toward the sky like grasping fingers. This was where the orders for the Valoran massacre had been given. This was where Dreven slept peacefully while billions died. But their target was not Dreven himself. Ambassador Kira Voss had discovered something far more valuable than revenge. Beneath the Council, capital city, there existed a vast underground complex called the Archives. For 10,000 years, the Council had kept records of everything they had done, every treaty they had broken, every species they had enslaved, every massacre they had ordered. The Archives contained evidence of crimes so terrible that even the Council's allies would turn against them if they knew the truth. Captain Marcus Webb led the ground team. His operators had trained for months on simulated versions of the archive facility. They knew every corridor and every security checkpoint and every guard rotation. They had practiced until they could move through the complex blindfolded. The insertion shuttle detached from the Wraith and descended toward the planet's surface. It was smaller than a cargo container and completely invisible to all sensors. It landed in a park 2 kilometers from the archive entrance, and the team emerged into the darkness of the Centauri night. They moved through the streets like shadows. Security patrols passed within meters of them and noticed nothing. Surveillance systems looked right at them and saw only empty air. They reached the archive entrance and disabled the locks without triggering any alarms. The complex was massive. Corridors stretched 4 kilometers in every direction. Data storage units lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The accumulated records of 10,000 years of tyranny surrounded them. Dr. Samuel Grant was with the team. He had volunteered for this mission because he had witnessed the massacre firsthand, and he wanted to see justice done. His job was to identify the most important records and ensure they were properly extracted. They worked quickly and silently. Captain Webb secured each section while Dr. Grant and the technical specialists copied data onto portable storage devices. They found records of the Valoran massacre with detailed orders signed by High Counselor Dreven himself. They found evidence of dozens of other genocides that the galaxy had never known about. They found financial records showing how Council members had grown rich from the suffering of billions. Lieutenant Price monitored the operation from the Wraith. She tracked guard movements and warned Captain Webb whenever patrols approached. Her voice was calm and steady, even as the tension grew unbearable. 2 hours passed. The team had collected enough evidence to destroy the Council forever. Captain Webb ordered the withdrawal, and they began making their way back to the extraction point. They were almost at the shuttle when something went wrong. A guard stumbled upon their path by pure accident. He saw movement where there should have been none, and he raised his weapon to call for help. Captain Webb was faster. He neutralized the guard silently before any alarm could be raised. But the delay cost them precious seconds. Other guards were approaching. The team ran. They abandoned stealth and sprinted for the shuttle with their precious cargo. Guards shouted behind them. Alarms began to wail across the city. The shuttle lifted off just as security forces reached the park. They fired at the empty air, but the shuttle was already invisible and climbing toward orbit. Captain Webb allowed himself to breathe for the first time in hours. Commander. Cole brought the Wraith alongside the shuttle and took the team aboard. The Shadow Fleet began its withdrawal from Centaura. Behind them, the planet was in chaos as Council forces searched desperately for intruders who were already gone. When the fleet reached safe distance, they transmitted the evidence on every frequency across the entire galaxy. Every screen on every world showed the records of Council crimes. Billions of beings watched as the truth was finally revealed. The effect was immediate and devastating. Species that had served the Council for centuries saw the proof of what had been done to others like them. They saw that they could be next. They saw that the Council had never been their protectors, but their oppressors. The Kreth rose up and threw off their chains. The Luminari demanded justice for their destroyed homeworld. Dozens of species withdrew from the Council alliance. Centauri colonies declared independence. The great empire that had ruled the galaxy began to collapse. High Counselor Drevin was arrested by his own guards 3 days later. They had seen the evidence, and they would no longer follow a monster. He was turned over to a newly formed galactic tribunal to face justice for his crimes. Admiral Laura Weed Bennett stood beside High Speaker Taloris as the verdict was announced. Guilty on all charges. The old Valoran wept quietly. His people had not been avenged through violence, but through truth. That seemed fitting for a species that had always believed in wisdom over war. Commander. Cole watched the proceedings from the bridge of the Wraith. His crew gathered around him in silence. They had done what many thought was impossible. They had defeated an empire, not with overwhelming force, but with patience and precision and the courage to strike from the shadows. The stars that had been ruled by fear for 10,000 years now held the promise of something new. Freedom was spreading across the galaxy, like light after a long darkness, and those who had threatened the innocent had learned a lesson they would never forget. Humanity protected its friends. Humanity delivered justice. And sometimes the most dangerous enemy was the one you never saw coming.